Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, I'm going to be running through 10 units that I think need a buff or a nerf in Star Wars Legion. So, as you may be able to guess from the number of units that have been selected, I'm basically going to be picking one unit from each faction to buff and one faction from each unit to nerf. I'm not saying these are objectively the worst or the best units in each faction. I'm just saying these are the ones that came to mind when I was thinking about units that I'd like to see buffed or nerfed in the game. I'm going to go through faction by faction, and then maybe at the end I'll talk about like which of those I feel are kind of most urgent, because I think there are some that could really do with a bit of an update sooner rather than later. So let's get started, and we'll begin with Gar. So I'll do the buffed unit first, which I'm going to be choosing as the Wookiee Warriors, and these are the ranged Wookiees, so the Kashyyyk Defenders. I think you can definitely also make a case for kind of buffing the melee version of the Wookiees, but I personally find the ranged version of the Wookiees more interesting, and I think they're kind of more a unit that you can maybe have more options with, perhaps, whereas I think the melee Wookiees are kind of forced into a kind of a more linear playstyle. So for these Wookiees, I think there are a number of changes you could make to buff them, and I think I'm not suggesting all of these, by the way, so I will list quite a few. I don't think all of these should be done, because then I think all the units I'm suggesting would become either extremely good or extremely bad. But one option, which I think would be quite straightforward, would just be Tactical 1 and Precise 1. I think with their dice pool, which tends to be quite white dice heavy, admittedly with Surge to Hit, but still quite white dice heavy, having those rerolls a bit like, you see with Bosk, for instance, and that getting those aims and the Precise 1 could be super useful. So that would be, I think, just quite a nice change to kind of up their firepower, because I think currently you can spend upwards of 100 points on this unit and it doesn't even hit that hard. Like generally it'll be throwing, if you take the Bowcaster, it's probably going to be 7 white and a red, which is probably about 4 hits, Pierce 1 with Sharpshooter 1, which just isn't very impressive. So this with an aim maybe takes that up to like maybe 6 Pierce 1, for instance, and suddenly that becomes a bit more compelling. The other option is to make them just that bit tougher. So you could give them arm 1 base. The other option was low profile, but they didn't feel that quite fitted with Wookiees that well. But maybe that's an option, giving them low profile, just something to increase their kind of defensive solidity a bit. There's also an option, a bit like the Commander Chewie has, to give them sort of reliable. So maybe take 1 surge, 2 surges or something, just to give you that bit more solidity. I'd also suggest that the X1 carbine, so the base weapon, could go up to a black and a white. I don't think that would be that ridiculous. I mean, again, stacking these changes, it would start to go maybe a bit too much, but it's not that big a change. Going from 6 white on the base unit to 3 black and 3 white, in the context of a lot of other special forces, think about Arc, Sleeper Cell, etc. I don't think that would be that insane. So again, that is just an option. Maybe make them feel that bit better to use. A points change, I think I was a bit reluctant to just suggest points changes with a lot of these, because those are just quite straightforward, and I don't think that's the kind of thing I'm super interested in talking about. But again, you could just drop the base cost down from 72 to 65. AMG seem to be quite prone to this kind of around 10% points change, so I think that would be quite reasonable to suggest. And then that would mean all the heavy weapons would actually be coming down by about 3, but I would suggest maybe a bit nearer to 5 to kind of make them feel that bit more compelling. And then, that takes the cost of the unit from just over 100 to nearer 90. And again, that starts to feel that bit better. That kind of 10% points reduction does feel pretty good. And then some kind of independent as well. So you kind of see this a bit with the Battle Force, where they can get those free speed 1 moves whenever a rookie in the unit's defeated. So again, there's that option there to maybe give them that bit more maneuverability, or perhaps, they take a shot 1 turn, and then if they don't get an order the next turn, they can use that independent move to jump behind cover, again, to give them that bit more solidity. So I think there are a few options. Again, not all of these, but I think the most basic one, just a tactical 1 and a precise 1, would be super nice. Like, getting those extra aims would feel really good. So there's an option. Moving over to the unit I'm going to nerf, I've spoken about this a few times. It's Bad Batch, and for this one, I think a points change is pretty much required, just because of the way the unit's designed. I think actually the way the unit's built is actually fine, and it feels kind of how it should. It feels like a unit with a bit of a box of tricks that can just be a menace, be very tough on the battlefield, and then as you gradually chip it down, it kind of loses those abilities. So I'm kind of fine with the fundamental way that Bad Batch are designed. I think currently they're just a bit too survivable, And in the early game, I think they can just be a little bit too, I'm going to stop short saying oppressive, but a little bit too powerful. Like, it's very difficult to sort of counterplay into them when kind of their threat range is what it is. And you kind of end up just sort of giving up and just accepting that Bad Batch are going to shoot, which doesn't feel great. And I think that's kind of fine to exist, but then there hopefully should be more counterplay in the following turns and maybe more of a realistic chance of killing them. So my suggestion is a 15 or 20 point change. This is also for the Rebel one as well, not just for the Gar one. So that would push them up to sort of 175, 180, which I think would feel a bit better. Again, around that kind of 10% points increase, which AMG tend to do. Also, I really dislike the design of Hunter's free sort of dagger thing. Same as with like the marksman units. I don't like the auto wound abilities, so I would change it to act very, very similarly, but be based on 1 black dice with range 1 and pierce 1. So ends up being very similar, but your opponent has more kind of counterplay options. In some ways, it's actually more likely to hit, because if you have a surge, you're then hitting on 5 of the dice faces rather than just 4. But the range 1 and pierce 1, it would also give a suppression, which it doesn't do anyway. So it's not like a strict nerf. I just really dislike the auto wound abilities. So again, that's an option. The other one, which I think might be a bit too much, but is one if you don't want to make that points change, is to reduce Echo to be reliable too. So currently it just feels like they surge all the time. But again, if you could just take 1 surge away, like that's a huge deal, don't get me wrong. Like, that firstly reduces your firepower quite significantly, because you're much less likely to burn maybe that 1 or 2 surges that you might have done normally. You need to kind of save them for your defense. But I think just maybe taking away one surge might make the unit feel quite different. One buff I would suggest is, and it might feel a bit neater in the way that a lot of units' weapons have been changed recently, is to make the blasters work in melee. Fundamentally, it doesn't actually change the dice pool that much, but it means that often with Bad Batch, when you're in melee, you end up just doing like an aim punch. And in that situation, your aim becomes that bit more useful. So it might just feel like, because currently there is this like huge disparity between their effectiveness when they're out of melee and when they're in melee. And this might just be a little change that maybe makes them feel sort of a little bit better in melee. Not a huge change, but just that little bit better. Moving over to Shadow Collective, and I don't actually think there are that many units that in Shadow Collective that need a huge buff. I think the one that I would like to see changed is Maul. Currently 150 points. I think he is just way overcosted. So I would bring him down to around 130. Again, around that sort of 10%, slightly over in this case, points change. And I think he could go further. I think you could make the case, as I'm going to make later for the other version of Maul in Separatist, that you could bring him down to be that bit cheaper. But I think he is more effective and maybe feels a bit better in Shadow Collector than he does in Separatist. So being that bit more expensive might be justifiable. The other thing I'd make him do is, because he is an operative, he would normally be able to take Strike Team Leader, but when you take the Darksaber, he can't do that. So I would just give him the ability to take Strike Team Lead if you want to combine with Rookcast. So I think just that little bit of extra synergy, because Gar Saxon has, you know, a bit more inherent synergy with Shadow Collective, so maybe something that gives Maul that bit more synergy with the units you're probably going to be taking him with might just make him feel that bit better. So yeah, not huge changes to Maul, but I think in his case a points drop is appropriate because I think his design is fine, but I think just giving him that bit more synergy with Rookcast and things like that might just make him a bit better. Rookcast Blaster also getting Lethal 1 and Suppressive, especially if you're able to take Strike Team Lead. You got that retinue and maybe a dodge, a bit like you can do with Sabine and Clan Ren. Feels pretty good, and they have access to Lethal 1 and Suppressive on their guns, so I think giving Shadow Collective access to that as well feels pretty fair. Nerf unit, it's going to be Swoops. I think these are the best unit in Shadow Collective. I think you could make a pretty legitimate argument for them being one of the best units in the game. And I think they're not like a million miles away from being fine, but I think just a couple of things to tone them down a little bit. I think they live a little bit on a knife edge to Swoops. I think they could go from being very strong to sort of very weak quite quickly, just because their abilities, because they proc off movement, as soon as you start to mess with those a little bit, because they're able to do 3 moves a turn, a small change on the way sort of their abilities to interact with movement can go quite a long way. So I would change the Vibro Axe to be overrun 1, because technically there's a FAQ about this. If one of the units died, you can still do 2 overruns a turn because the weapon has overrun 2. So that is a change I would make, just to tone it down to overrun 1, which again incentivizes you to actually kill one of the swoops. Whereas currently, even if you kill both the swoops, because currently if you only kill one, they're still able to put out some really reasonable damage. Another little thing to tone them down is just to take away reinforcements. This isn't a huge change, but that extra speed 1 move as well can just give them so much reach on like turn 1, turn 2. So I think just taking away that little bit of movement might be quite nice. You could go for a little 10% points increase if you wanted to, between 75 to 80, I think would feel pretty fair. They do seem to be the best of kind of the speedy units, the Staps, Speeder Bikes, those other units kind of floating around that 70 point sort of area. So I think a little points increase would be absolutely fine. And then a more sort of wide reaching one is maybe changing the way overrun works, because currently it almost feels like you're taking advantage of the game system a little bit. So if I don't have the solution, but if there is a way to make overrun maybe feel that bit better, maybe you have to make a complete move, for instance, rather than the current thing of just sort of, you can do like a little stutter and you count as doing an attack, might feel that bit better. So maybe there's a way to kind of rework overrun in a way that still is quite powerful, but maybe just feels a bit better to play into. But yeah, the idea with all of these is just to lower their efficiency a little bit and maybe take away a bit of their potential for kind of some crazy damage. The triple speed 3 move with the attack and 2 overruns, which can just be kind of bonkers. Like throwing 4 reds, 2 black, and 4 white with surge to hit, 2 of those attacks not getting cover, etc., while moving across half the board just feels a bit nuts. So I think taking that away feels pretty good. Or some of that way, at least. Moving to Empire, and I'm going to be suggesting a buff to Fifth Brother. I did pick him out as kind of the worst unit, or you guys, I think, voted him as the worst unit in Empire. And yeah, I think there's so many things you could do with him. Personally, I think putting Relentless on his base card is not the way to go. I think him with Relentless, you would have to push his cost up, and then that kind of nudges him into a kind of weird space where he wouldn't feel that efficient. So I think just putting Relentless on his 3-pip command card, for instance, would feel quite good. And then also I'd give him the ability to give himself a wound, so you could have maybe more control over how that enrage ability procs. So for instance, if you've just been plinked for 1 damage, then maybe you could opt to take another wound, so dropping yourself down to only 4, but then you are getting that charge on that infinite courage, which I think controlling that ability would feel really good. So maybe there's something there in just controlling that enrage ability. Another option is for Reliable 1, so just making him that bit tougher, and with that immune pierce and getting access to even 1 surge can be super valuable. See people taking into the fray on their Jedi very commonly, so getting access to 1 surge could be super powerful. And then finally, they are technically, allied with Vader, even though he doesn't, I don't think he sees them that way necessarily. So some kind of retinue or synergy ability with Vader could be quite fun. Like Empire's leaning on Vader quite heavily at the moment, so that would be another thing, maybe quite a natural piece of synergy to give you that extra aim or that dodge, for instance. That would then have the effect of also buffing up Seventh Sister as well, but maybe that's okay. I don't think either of these units could be termed as remotely oppressive or competitive right now, so maybe there's something in just a little buff for Fifth Brother and by proxy for Seventh Sister as well. Moving over to the unit that needs a nerf, it's obviously Range Troopers. I think this kind of speaks for itself. It's been, about a year since they were nerfed last, so we've had time to absorb that one, and I think it's about time they go up by 10 points again. I think, obviously, the key is when Empire is in the state it's in, kind of make it a bit worse and make people feel worse about it. So maybe 10 points isn't enough. Maybe they need to go up to 15, or maybe just remove from the game, i.e. Royal Guard and Palpatine. Buffed units for Rebels is going to be Daimyo Boba Fett. There are quite a few units that I think could do with a little buff in Rebels. Not because Rebels isn't competitive, just because there are units that you don't see very much that kind of float around the periphery and aren't super competitive. So you could go for Chewie, for instance. I think even you can make an argument for Op Luke. just because I think he's now so expensive and just doesn't seem to have kept up with the other units that are competitive in Rebels. But the problem is with all three of those I've just suggested is they exist in the Rebel Operative slot, which is one of those competitive slots in the game. So trying to compete with those is maybe not the way to go. So I'm going to take probably not the worst of the three, actually, because Chewie probably is the worst, but I'm going to take Daimyo Boba as a unit that I'd really like to see a bit more in the game. So my suggestions to kind of make Boba just feel more impactful, because I think currently he has the tools. Like, I love that independent standby, but since they nerf standbys to not be very good, and he's on average only putting out 2 PS1 anyway, and yes, you can use it for a free move, but then if you're using it for a free move, a conditional free move, that's not great. And most armies will have access to, well, either they'll be close enough to just shoot off your standby before you get to go, or they'll have something with range 4 that can blink it off outside your standby range. So I think he needs some other tools besides that kind of independent standby and his command cards to sort of excel. So my first suggestion is that the E3 gains versatile and goes to 4 black dice. So this means if you are trapped in melee, you can actually make use of his Arsenal 2 keyword, which I think would feel quite good. And I think this would mean that Boba being in melee feels significantly better, because suddenly you go from, only throwing 3 red and a black to suddenly throwing 3 red and 5 black PS1, which, now I say it, sounds maybe a bit too strong. So maybe if you did give it versatile, it would stay at only 3 black dice. But I think something like that, because he used to have versatile on his weapons, and so does like Din Djarin, for instance. I think there is something there about making him just feel a bit more punchy in melee and being able to kind of control that combat a bit more. I would also take his sort of rocket command card and get rid of it, and then just give it to him as a piece of equipment. So you could take his flamethrower and his rocket, make it around kind of 5 to 8 points. I think would be absolutely fine, because I'm fairly sure it's 3 red, and I think that would just feel pretty good as a piece of optional equipment. Again, like, you could use those pieces of equipment as you moved up the board. So initially you're firing his EE3 and maybe his rocket and maybe separate targets with his Arsenal 2. And then when you're a bit closer, you can make use of his EE3 and his flamethrower. So just, again, getting more use out of that Arsenal 2 and those aims that you're going to be generating from his tactical and from his standbys. The other option is a bit similar to his younger form. You could choose, I wouldn't make it independent. I would say when he got an order, so keep his independent standby, but you could choose maybe between target 1 or defend 1. That could be a choice at the start of the game, or that could be a choice each turn. I think that would just be quite good, because currently you really don't want to give Boba an order, so that incentive to maybe more occasionally give him an order, because a lot of the time, especially if you're taking his whipcord launcher, for instance, or if you're taking his Rule with Respect 3 pip, those are 2 out of the, if we're being realistic, 4 turns where you're actually choosing command cards where he is going to get an order. So then his standby's only going off twice. So then I think he needs something when he gets an order. So I think that would feel a bit better. And again, if you want to keep it nice and simple, just go for that around 10% sort of points drop to around 110, 105, which would just make him that bit more efficient. And him at 105 would actually feel pretty good, I think. And alongside like IG11, for instance, if you could bring those, well, IG's already 105 to be fair, but if IG came down maybe below 100, and then once you equip him with the sort of bounty program, he goes up to 100, I think it would feel all right. So yeah, I think any of these, definitely not all of these, but a couple of these changes would feel really good on Boba. Nerfed unit is going to be the Landspeeder. Already covered Bad Batch in the sort of GAR section. I would have chosen them here if I hadn't chosen them in the GAR section, but looking at the Landspeeder, and I think this has just become a bit too omnipresent for me. Like, I think now when I'm building a list, I kind of have to actively look for reasons not to include a Landspeeder. And I think so often, because Rebels can very easily push kind of 12, 13 acts and still have 2 Landspeeders, they just feel so oppressive in the early game. Like, they're nearly always going to get to shoot very effectively, and there's not a lot your opponent can really do about it. So I think toning them down a little bit, maybe also shifting their focus a bit away from maybe that kind of long range artillery piece to maybe incentivizing getting that bit sort of closer, and maybe buffing a few weapons that benefit from being closer and nerfing a few weapons that benefit from being further away. So my first nerf is going to be Unstable Astro, goes up by either 4 or 5 points. I haven't quite decided. I'm going to say 5 points, up to 11 points, so from 6 up to 11. I think currently just getting a free attack for extra 6 points is too strong, even if it does damage yourself. Like, you normally have maybe an Astro or two knocking around to heal yourself back up, so it's not actually that much of a big deal. And as I've said before, when you're very easily pushing 4 or 5 hits through armor, that is probably just a bit too much. The other option is the fixed medium blaster. Yes, you don't have to take the ion gun. There is another option, the fixed medium blaster, which is currently range 3 and 4 black dice. I suggest it goes to suppressive and gains 5 black dice, so not a points change, just buffing it a bit. And again, this maybe shifts you more towards a kind of anti-infantry type deal rather than the current form, which is very much slanted towards armor. It can definitely put in work against infantry in a pinch, but your sort of more ideal targets are against armor. I'm also going to suggest the pilot's pistol goes up to a red and a white. You know, looking for more of an incentive to get a bit closer and kind of use that pistol. You could even buff it even further if you wanted to, but then I was a bit worried that the sort of budget version of the Landspeeder would start to become maybe a little bit strong. So you could go for like a red and a black, for instance, as well. But yeah, I think throwing a red and a white in there on top of the additions instead of the 2 white you get at the moment would feel pretty good. And I'd suggest the Ion Heavy, so that's the one that's currently 28 points, ranged 4, fixed front, goes up to 32, so just a bit of a nerf there. And you could make the same argument for the Rocket as well if you wanted to, sort of going up by around 4 or 5 points. But yeah, the idea of this is just to move away from this really standard composition we see a lot of the time and maybe introduce a kind of more competitive option, competitive version of the Landspeeder that might not replace the current composition, but it might just give people more kind of alternative options, because you want to be able to use your land speeders on the board. Like, I think it's key that nerfing units doesn't mean that they're completely like unviable. It just needs to be that they're kind of more toned down and maybe don't always do the same thing every time, which can feel really bad to play into. Moving over to Separatist, and you'll never guess which unit I'm suggesting gets a nerf, but talking about the buffed units first, I think Maul needs to come down to 120 or 115, kind of in line with the other Force user changes, Ahsoka Ventress that we saw. Sabine, Force user depends if you buy into the into the Ahsoka series, but so yeah, I think just a small change there, again around that 10% change, would feel really good and make Maul feel like less of an investment for something that is so fragile. Like, I think the problem for him and for Ventress specifically is realistically they've got 5 health and they don't natively surge to defend. So you are then relying on them not taking 10 wounds in one go, which is an Arc Medic squad. For instance, they can normally push close to 10. Sleeper Cell could very easily push that as well. Like, these budget units should not be sort of the ones threatening. It should feel the kind of these units that may be threatening them a bit more. So make them cheaper, make them more efficient would be my suggestion. Also, I'd let Juyo Mastery allow for 3 moves a turn. Like, maybe this could be a bit tricky with Burst of Speed, but also if they're doing 3 speed, well, yeah, after you infiltrate, but then you would need to take a wound, which you can't do off the infiltrate command card. I don't know. I think it's fine to allow 3 speed 3s. It might in reality turn out to be a bit too much, but it feels bad that, you know, for instance, off like new ways to motivate them, for instance, you can do 3 speed 3 moves with, say, Din, or I don't know, if you're running an Inquisitor with Burst of Speed, for instance. Like, I think Maul should have access to that. I think that's okay, especially as he doesn't have, you know, Relentless or Charge. I think that's probably fine. Surge to hit, if you really want it. It would take away from his Jedi Hunter card and things like that, so maybe that's not the way to go. He definitely shouldn't get Surge to defend. I don't think that's the right course of action. I mean, maybe a reliable one again. Like, I think it's a bit of a safe default for a lot of Force users to say like reliable one, just because surges are so useful for them. And I think one surge feels okay. I think it's when you start to really stack those surges it can start to feel quite oppressive. So maybe it would be a bit much, but I think reliable one would probably be okay on Maul. And the nerfed unit, to nobody's surprise, is going to be Aqua Droids. I think when I was critiquing the Landspeeders for having this very linear playstyle that you just run into over and over again, I think that's an issue with Aqua Droids. I think every game I play into them feels exactly the same. And while I think I have got better at emotionally handling them and handling them in the game, I think they are still too strong and too efficient. So these are the changes I'm suggesting. If you want to take away kind of their crazy threat on turn one, I think that's what makes Aqua Droids feel particularly bad, is that they can wait. Like, you can stack acts in Separatist, goes to like 12 or 13, then you can drop late, and it forces your opponent to sit so far back, because with an infiltrate and their speed 1 inverted commas, which is actually more like a speed 2 on an infantry base, they have an effective threat range of about range 5, which is just bonkers. Like, it's such a lot to deal with, and it's one of those things that can really push you back, and they can push you back with no consequence because they're so tough. It's not like, if you push a Landspeeder up the middle, they're a lot more vulnerable, for instance. Or, even Bad Batch, if you send Bad Batch up the middle, that's a really hefty investment. And then if Bad Batch were to get tied up in melee, they then lose a lot of their effectiveness, whereas Aqua Droids can't be tied up in melee and all this stuff. Like, there just isn't that consequence of being more aggressive with Aquas. So one option, remove their surge to hit. On average, this would probably take away about a hit and a half on their sort of normal dice pool of, if you're taking the heavy, I think it's 3 black, 4 white, and 2 red, which I think is just a bit much. So yeah, taking away one of those surges to hit would probably take away about a hit and a half on average. So I think you probably drop from around 5 to maybe a bit closer to, well, just underneath 4, I think. Obviously, they can still get, aims from link targeting array and stuff like that. Like, I think that would still be something that people would run, but maybe taking away that surge hit would just lower their threat a bit. Another option is prepared position rather than infiltrate. This, I think, would be a really, really big change for the way Aquas are played. And I think if you were to change it from infiltrate to prepared position, the unit would become very weak, and it would just be a question of whether or not that's something you want to do. Because, as I said, one of the big powers of Aquas, I think, is waiting, then jumping on, providing that cover, hitting that damage. Whereas if you prepared position them, you just put a big target on them for all of your opponent's long range stuff to shoot at them turn 1. So yeah, I don't know. I think that might be a bit much. Or maybe you start with base prepared position and then you can pay a points premium or something to get hold of infiltrate. But I don't know. I think this would be a very severe change, but it was just sort of one I wanted to throw out there. And then the change that I actually think will happen is 7-point increase for the base unit, again around 10%, and 5 points for the heavy. This seems pretty typical. So moves the cost of the unit up from, I think, about 93, 92, up to just over 100, up to 105. And I think at over 100, they feel a bit better. They feel less efficient. And this is one of those changes that, because a lot of, well, I don't think a lot of competitive lists at the top end are necessarily running 2, but if you are running 2, it's suddenly a 24-point change, which is taking away most of an act. And then if you take away most of an act, maybe you go from 12 to 11, and then maybe you have more stuff to shoot them with and all this kind of stuff. Like, it is these ripple effects of these nerfs that they don't just happen in isolation. And as soon as, I think it was what we saw with like the Gar nerfs, as soon as it started to cost activation count, it really started to hit those lists. And I think at this kind of points level, it might just rob you of an activation, which would be a really big deal. So yeah, that would be my suggestive change for Aqua Droids. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Are there any, well, there are loads I missed. I'm not going to pretend I hit all of them. But are there any that you think should be changed? How do you think they should be changed? Do you disagree? Do you agree with any of my changes? I'd be very surprised if you agree with all of them. But yeah, I think full credit to where the game is right now. I think it is fairly balanced. I think Separatists are the best faction, but I don't think they're a million miles ahead. And I think you can tool your list in a certain way to be able to deal with them fairly well. So I think the game's actually in a pretty reasonable state. Obviously, we're going to see some big changes coming up soon with the new objectives. New Empire Command, for instance. Grievous on Wheelbike has potential to just be absolutely catastrophic, and I'm really hoping that they get the balance on those right. So maybe these, I doubt we'll see any changes immediately, and probably certainly not these changes, but maybe after things have settled down a bit, we might see a couple of changes to some of these units. And it would be really nice if definitely some of the less good units, AMG seem more likely to do buffs than nerfs. So maybe some of the less good units could just get a little bit of a buff to help them maybe to be that bit more competitive. But yeah. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, subscribe, etc. And I will see you for the next one.